The Forde report confirmed that Labour has a problem with anti-black racism and Islamophobia. It also confirmed that right-wing staff had tried to undermine Jeremy Corbyn and that much of the media coverage of the anti-Semitism row had been wholly misleading. Yet despite this, or perhaps because of this, the media have largely ignored the report's release. And as far as I'm aware, this clip shows the only time Keir Starmer has been asked about the report's findings.
The Forde report, such as we've seen it, does paint a pretty dysfunctional picture of the Labour Party behind the scenes. What action is going to follow from it?
What the Forde report shows is how dysfunctional the Labour Party was under Jeremy Corbyn, because it was a report on what the situation was 2 years ago. I didn't need the report to tell me we needed to take action. I've been taking action in those intervening 2 years. Obviously, we'll reflect on everything in the report, and where we need to make further changes, we will. But I didn't need the report to tell me that I needed to change the Labour Party, and we've been hard doing that, making progress, but you can never say the job is done on anti-Semitism, being very clear that we unshakably support NATO, being very clear that we are pro-business, we work with business, and being very clear that as a party, we've got to stop talking to ourselves and we've got to turn inside out and talk to our voters wherever they are.
What action is going to follow from this report that exposes a racist culture and shows subversion by unelected staff? We're going to be pro-business and reaffirm our unshakable commitment to NATO. Talk about non sequiturs. I mean, one of those things has nothing whatsoever to do with the other thing. Dahlia, I mean, that's almost like a parody of Keir Starmer, isn't it? What are you going to do about racism in your party? We will reaffirm our commitment to NATO. How are those two things connected? Like, he can't. Does he listen to the question before he answers the question, or is he just so complacent because he knows that no one asks him difficult questions when it comes to, the left, when it comes to racism? If it wasn't the anti-Semitism row and Jeremy Corbyn, he just says anything. I mean, that was just a bizarre list that had nothing to do with the question at all.
Well, I think it shows that he is rightly very confident that the media are not going to challenge him on the systemic anti-black racism and Islamophobia that pervades the Labour Party from top to bottom. Both when we are looking at interpersonal racism, I mean, just look at the treatment of Afsana Begum and like the kind of personal experiences of Black and Muslim people in this party. But also when you look at policy, the systemic policies of the Labour Party have historically been invested in Islamophobia and anti-Black racism. Prevent, which is one of the most Islamophobic pieces of domestic legislation that we have in this country, the groundwork for that was laid during the Labour Party government. The Labour Party government was the government that took us to war with Iraq, which was undergirded and justified using Islamophobic narratives. And so he is fairly confident that he's not going to be seriously challenged on those things in the media, because the media is very much invested and embedded in those principles as well. And I think it really goes to show the disregard with which Keir Starmer and the Labour Party leadership in general, the disregard with which they hold constituencies of people that have repeatedly put the Labour Party in power, supported the Labour Party, given their vote, given their activism, given their organising, and the contempt with which they are being treated by the leadership is frankly shocking. And I don't understand how it's not going to result in a backlash at the next election. But clearly, they believe that they can take the votes of those constituencies for granted. Keir Starmer couldn't even name the words Islamophobia and anti-Black racism in that answer, even though that was one of the central points that would be, and one of the most alarming points that were being made in the Forde report. And so, honestly, it's just, to me, the fact that he couldn't even say those words and the fact that he felt so confident that he wouldn't be challenged on those things, even though they were central findings of the report, just goes to show how disempowered and poorly treated these communities are, not only by the media, which fails to represent them, and when it does represent them, it's often in ways that are stigmatizing and harmful, but also within the party that these constituencies have given their vote and their work and their organizing work to for decades. The question is, how long can they rely on the idea that black and brown people in this country, that the alternative is so much worse for them, that the Tory party is so much worse for them. I don't know how long them being able to rely on that is going to last before they're going to actually have to start treating these constituencies as people whose vote and support they have to earn, rather than they can just simply rely on the fact that the alternative is so much worse.
So as you suggested at the start of your answer, probably the reason Keir Starmer is able to get away with that is because the only people who have taken the report less seriously than him is the mainstream media. And sociologist, Tom Mills, socialist as well, I think, has done some research showing just how out of character that is. The number of reports in the UK national press in the week following the publication of the Forde report and the broadcast of BBC Panoramas is Labour anti-Semitic. And you can see here, in the week after that Panorama documentary, the Times and the Sunday Times did 67 articles on Labour and anti-Semitism. The Forde report, which, as we've talked about on previous shows, suggested that Panorama documentary, among other media reports, was wholly misleading. They've written 2 about it. The Daily Telegraph, it's 19 after the Panorama documentary, 1 after the Forde report. For the Mirror, supposedly left-wing, 24 after the Panorama documentary, 1 after the Forde report. The Mail, 18 and 2. Even The Guardian, 27 after the Panorama documentary and 9 after the Forde report. So you can see here, newspapers who were very, very, very interested in issues of internal party politics, complaints procedures, racism within a party. This was big front page news when it was something which could damage Jeremy Corbyn. When you've got a report which shows issues which wouldn't damage Jeremy Corbyn, potentially would damage the centrist leadership of the Labour Party, or which you just can't weaponise at all, they're just completely bored of it, completely uninterested. And it's especially notable given that one thing the Forde report states in pretty clear terms is that a lot of the reporting, for example, the reporting after that Panorama documentary, was wholly misleading. Now, a QC has put together a report about that, sort of laid the facts on the table. Silence, not interested. And I do think it just tells us so many things about politics in this country, which is the extent, I think, to which these rows are completely manipulated and dictated and governed by the interests of the media. You've got racism in the party, which can become the biggest issue of the day. And as I say, we've always said there was some real anti-Semitism in the Labour Party and it was not dealt with perfectly, right? I think that's a legitimate news story, but it became the biggest story in the country. We've got the Forde report, which also shows some racism in the party, which was not dealt with very effectively. Suddenly that's not an interest. That's just internal party stuff. Internal party stuff was all you talked about for 4 years. Like, come on. And obviously that Keir Starmer answer. I mean, I feel like that you say that to a BBC journalist, oh no, we're pro-NATO, don't worry about the report. They'll be like, oh yeah, legitimate response. Keir Starmer, forensic.